Part of growing a great deer herd is actually controlling the amount of time that a buck is on your land. So if he's on your land during the daylight more than anyone else's land, then you kind of win the game, because you have the opportunity to advance him to the next age class, to hunt him, to shoot him, to kill him if you want to. But bottom line is, it's very important to manage the time he's on your land. And how do you do that? Well, I'm going to tell you how you do that. But one of the thoughts is, you take a small hunting plot like this. This is a plot I shot bow on last year. It's not that I don't recommend you hunt on food plots. It's just that you should never hunt on a plot where you're going to spook deer off of those plots unless you shoot them. So if you can't get in and out of a plot without spooking deer, either on the way in or the way out, then you need to make changes. The plot needs to be smaller. You need to have better screening, better edging, better access getting in and out, where you blow your scent to. And then also, in a case like this, and this is kind of leading up to how you manage this, this is a small plot. We have a much larger plot right there. This is a 1/4 acre. That one right next door is an acre. And then we have a 2-acre plot past that. And they're all spaced out quite a bit. What that's doing is, a buck takes out of a bedding area, and we happen to know where Bo went into bed last year in the morning, so we knew where he was coming out, which is about 150 yards to 200 yards away from here. And he comes out of a bedding area, he hits a water hole, comes through a small plot, goes over to a big plot, stays in that big plot until dark, and that's how you control his time. The big temptation is, we come into a location like this, we have a mock scrape, we have a water hole, and you want everything as attractive as possible in this one location. And I've even been, it's kind of ridiculous, but we've even seen it where you come into a small plot like this and there's 25 mock scrapes around it. The thought is, we're going to control their time by giving them everything they need in one spot. Well, that buck isn't going to come out here. How many times have you ever seen a buck come through and hit 10 scrapes in a row in a small area like this? He doesn't do it. So that's why we only put 1 mock scrape on average per stand location. If we have a water hole, we want it separate from this food plot, because we're trying to strengthen the line of movement. But it's not just strengthening the line of movement. What's a line of movement? A phrase I coined many years ago, but you have a bedding area, you have a potential water hole, you have another bedding area that'd be more for does, fawns, you have a small plot, big plot, you have some mock scrapes in between, but that's a line of movement that you've strengthened with attractions on private land. On public land, you're looking for that line of movement. You're looking for potential buck bedding, then doe bedding, then food source, and maybe a water source in between, scrapes or rubs in between. And that's where you're defining that line of movement. You can find that on public land. You can create it on private land. You want all those pieces separate. You're not controlling that buck's time by having everything in one location. That's just giving him all those attractions. Now you're diluting all those attractions because he was coming to this food plot anyways. Give him a separate water hole, for example. You give him a separate water hole. Now he gets out of that bedding area. He hits the water hole. Then he hits a small plot. And then he's on the way to the big plot. It takes him a lot of time to do that. There's only so much. He's not moving during daylight hours that often. The water hole, so critical to be separate from this food plot, because a food plot is a high risk. Anytime a buck goes to a big open water source, especially the older he gets, or a big open food plot, the food plot is very high risk. The water hole is very low risk. You'll hit that at all hours of the day. So by putting a water hole and adding it to this food plot, you're diminishing the value of the water hole. You're making it a high risk attraction then. Instead of that buck hitting it in the morning, he's probably only going to hit it in the afternoon, evening, which is where I shot bow last year in the same location, was in the afternoon. You want those separate. In fact, the water hole that relates to this, I can hunt this with westerly winds. The water hole I can't hunt with west winds. It blows right towards the bedding area. So by this being 100 yards, 150 yards away from that water hole, I can actually hunt this in the afternoon, evening. I can't hunt the water hole in the afternoon, evening with that same wind. So it's a different set of winds, different stand location, and that way you're separating out your stand locations. This one is more related to afternoon. Water hole is more related to any time of the day. You want those separate, but it's not just there. We've worked on the bedding area where we expect these deer to bed. If it's very thick, we have another stand location we can hunt there at the bedding area too. We have a mock scrape at the stand location. It's very thick. There's lots of browse, so it controls his time because he's got food and cover to work through. He's got a mock scrape at that stand location, just one. Then he comes here. We have a scrape right in front. Bo actually worked that scrape last year. Not a mock scrape, but a natural scrape. We'll put a mock scrape on there. Mock scrape's more dependable. But bottom line, there's a scrape at that stand location. Small hunting plot, so he goes, leaves his bedding area. That takes him a little bit of time. He's got some good browse in there. We've created that. Hits the water hole, hits a small plot, goes to the big plot. That's a line of movement. This extends over a few hundred yards. And we've worked on each one of these to make sure that he stays and he sticks and he wants to be here. That means the food source right here. We can't have any holes. The food source has to be attractive. He has to know it's here. We want it to last as long as possible. If this is a small food source here and this is the end of the line, the deer just feed here until dark. They consume it and then they're gone, and then there's a big gaping hole of attraction because all the food's gone. This isn't a hunting plot unless we have a bigger plot over there. So that's extending that line of movement. If the deer can't pass through here on the way to something else and it's just an end game for them, then we can't get in and out of the stand without spooking them because they're spending a high percentage of their time just right here, then the food's gone, and then they stop. Also, by having the larger food plot over there, it manages the time that he's on the land during daylight because he wants to get to that large food plot before dark. That's just, or at dark, around that time. Managing a buck's time on your land and controlling how much he's on your property during the daylight really boils down to how long, how strong your line of movement is and where he's coming from in that bedding area, where he's going to end up, and how many of those features and how strong they are with no holes he has to go through before he gets to that end game at dark. Again, he only has a certain amount of time he's going to move around during daylight. You separate these features out right here, make them as strong as possible, make them last. Don't overdo it in one spot. Separate your attractions, and that's how you make sure not only do you have a good chance of shooting that buck and you control his time, but you have a great chance of shooting that buck because you have different stand locations. You have different stand locations for more morning, by bedding and water, more afternoon, by small hunting plot or larger hunting plot. The holding plots we have, we can hunt with a gun from a distance. We have a situation right here where there's an elm on the inside here. You can barely see it coming up. But if we sit in at that elm there, we can actually get a shot across this food plot, that food plot, and the line of movement in between. So even if that buck doesn't want to come out into the open food in between, he can still go along the backside of this food plot, go through, hit a mock scrape, and keep going. But again, we're hitting them within these lines. We have different stands for different winds because the ground curves right through here, the land curves, and it gives you that line of movement. We have a lot of clients where a line of movement might be a whole two sides of a property with different features built in for morning stands, afternoon stands, water. And again, if you're just hunting public land, you can look for these lines of movement. You're hunting them the exact same way. My first book of designing whitetail property, it's Whitetail Success by Design. I talk about in the intro a big buck moving through the woods. Moment of truth arrives. I shoot him at 45 yards with a gun. In the conclusion, I revealed that that big buck was a public land hunt. So he was moving on public land. He was moving from his food source through that moving area, hitting a rub on the way, moving into his hidey hole bedding area. I'm waiting for him in the morning. He's going through all those pieces of that line of movement, and I shoot him, and I talk about that it was a public land buck in that conclusion. And the point of that is that this doesn't relate to just private land. It relates to public land too. It relates to anywhere you hunt a whitetail. Look for those lines of movement on public land, scout them, find them, assign areas you can hunt one location by bedding in the morning, hunt towards the food sources in the afternoon, hunt in between all day. And then on private land, because you have such a small area to work with, you know, when I'm hunting public land, it's thousands of acres. When you're hunting private land, it's 100 acres, 200 acres, 50, 40, 5 acres. Create that line of movement. You're doing the same thing that you would find on public land. You're just creating it on private land in a much smaller scale. And when you put all those lines together, whether it's on public land or private land, you have that mature buck because you're controlling the amount of time that he's on that land or in that line of movement. You're finding that on public land, creating it on private. And when you control that time, it's during daylight, and you can have different stands for different winds in morning and afternoon, then you have them. And that's why I talk about your target bucks. If you do this right on private land, you should shoot them 80% of the time over a 10-year period. That's a success we find. It's a success. That's a success that we find, and it's a level of success that I expect from you if you follow these tips and tactics, whether it's creating them on your own private land or scouting, finding, and hunting them on public land. You can manage that buck's time, and you'll manage your level of success and dictate your level of success for decades to come.